Hello, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful week and weekend, but also week, yeah. Let's talk about uh, empathy. How can we live an empathetic life? Um, that's a big question. I've been recently at an interesting conference on cognitive embodied experiences and marginalized body. And an important point was raised. Most of the disorders that we consider problematic in terms of empathetic connection with others are mostly considered disorders because people do not experience empathy in the same way as we do. So, I don't know, an autistic person or a person on the spectrum or a neurodivergent person is considered problematic in terms of the empathetic connection he or she can make. But in fact, it might very well be that the way in which they experience empathy is just different. So what's the normal way? Because that is another big question. I mean, what do we mean by empathy? How does empathy actually express itself? In phenomenology, we have different answers according to whom we ask. If we ask Husserl, who was very influenced by his student Edith Stein, empathy starts as a bodily movement, as a form of pairing by associations that we experience with another person. So there's nothing cognitive, but there's this immediate form of pairing association that we experience when we encounter someone who is similar to us. Here, there's a good example that my colleague Magnus Englander gave. And there's also a good article on the book Empathy and Ethics written by him, where he says, you know, if you encounter someone on the street and you have to decide which side of the road you are going to walk. There's an empathetic response because you both, rock here and there to try to give way to the person who is in front of you. And this empathetic response is not something cognitive, it's something that happens in a perceptive bodily way. So the first movement that we encounter in empathy, in an empathetic connection, is something bodily and is something perceptive. Then there's this second layer that, if you want, is more cognitive, which is the reflexive revelation. So through this perceptive pairing, you reflect on what makes the two of you similar, and you might understand something about the other person. Maybe when you encounter somebody on the street and the street is too small, there's no big reflexive revelation. But if you see somebody crying and the tears of this person might evoke something in you, then the reflective revelation can bring something more. So somebody is crying because they lost their job. You never lost your job. You don't know what that tears are about, what that kind of pain is about. But in the difference that is in between the two of you, there's something that allows to understand more about yourself and the other person. That's why, for example, psychotherapist Jung said that they felt particularly lucky in doing that job, because in that position they often understand something about themselves, even when the understanding wasn't immediately available. That form of empathetic connection is always there to teach you something about you. We have disorders like alexithymia, in which, for example, empathy doesn't seem to be triggered immediately as a perceptive pairing, but is pass through the grid of cognitive understanding. So they might understand why it's reasonable for that person to feel bad and for them to feel sad, but this doesn't come as an embodied understanding. Now, I wouldn't label a normal empathy, an abnormal empathy. Certainly, empathy is essential for us to live as fulfilled human beings, to connect with each other, to have a fulfilling life. However you reach this empathetic connection is up to you. For example, Levinas use the notion of face, image, to describe the importance of the other and the empathetic connection to the other. Levinas had unfortunately the experience to stay at a concentration camp. He was Jewish, and he recounts this experience he had while he thought that everything was lost. The fact that he could come back to his dorms, and on his way back there was this dog waiting for the inmates to come back, and this dog was looking at each of them in the face. Gave him that sense of humanity, that sense of ipseity, if you want, of being himself and just himself, that in the anonymity and cruelty of the concentration camp he was losing. He said that the presence of that dog was one of the reasons that helped him to remain sane, to remain a human being. And elsewhere, he uses still the notion of the face to explain that sense of responsibility that the face of the others call in you. There are times in which you just want to give up. You just want to let things go and just let yourself go. But then your friend, your mother, your child, he's there, looks at you. Just the fact that looks at you, that he's there like that dog in that moment, evokes in you the responsibility of an answer, the responsibility of I'm going to do that. You gather all the bodily presence that is around you, that is missing any agency and subjectivity, and you feel the demand for an answer, which could be even a no, but even a no is an answer to something that you are experiencing in that moment. So according to phenomenology, empathy is basically the main bridge that you built in in a societal life, in an interaffective life. In fact, the first empathy, if you want, you have in life is with yourself, in discovering when you realize that there's these hands, there's this body that moves and responds to my input, to my desire. This I, we, or just this recognition of an I is the first empathetic connection that you establish with yourself. And in this you realize that there's a we, because you realize that you yourself are the product of an intersubjective, interaffective network of people. So in that sense, phenomenology believes that is absolutely possible to describe something that is personal, that is inward, that is part of your inner life, without necessarily being overly personal. For example, because while you are capable of describing a lived experience that you look from your first perspective, you are also looking at this lived experience from an I-we perspective, from an intersubjective perspective, sometimes even from an I-thou, from a second perspective, because the face of the person you have in front of you or the animal you are looking at is telling you something that you feel about yourself. How often we see images of, again, pets on the death row for euthanasia, and we feel that sense of anguish in their eyes. Or we see a friend of ours in pain and we exactly know what they are going through. So in describing something inward, you manage to see something that does not belong just to you. Of course, you need to avoid to have projections. You have always to apply a pocket, to parenthesize that all that you look at might be just your assumption, to parenthesize as much as possible of your prejudices, of your projections. But nevertheless, if you manage to be 100% honest with what you're looking at, you arrive at a description of something that might be universal, something that can touch that life world, which is basically the framework in which your life gains meanings. The life world is a very powerful concept we already discussed, I think, in these phenomenology pills. That is basically the world of everyday things and perceptions, is the world in which your life occurs. And since your life is not just your life, but is the life of these empathetic connections, of this I-we, of this interaffective world that you create, this life world becomes an horizon of meanings that you give for granted, but they are always there to produce and sustain your life. So, for example, someone who grew up in a dysfunctional family and experience multiple traumas tends to live in a life world in which there are plenty of triggers that can still reenact the traumas they live. So it requires a very serious and responsible exploration of this life world to understand what are the meanings that are passively present there, that are encompassed in this frame, and see how and if it's possible to improve the life world with a shift of the framework by reorganizing the here neurophenomenology can also come at hand, reorganizing the neuronal connections that brings your brain to go over and over in the same circuit of pain. So this is another important concept in phenomenology that helps us to understand the human vulnerability, to understand where we are vulnerable. Where our source of pain can be, and again, here Levinas comes to mind, make a claim on us. So find irresistible to act for the good of yourself and others. So responding to that face, responding to that presence of the other, where the other can be also you, yourself, as a new person you're capable of looking at, as an alterity that you never considered as such, as a quest for knowing something new that you always gave for granted, and feeling that responsibility to answer, to take responsibility for that vulnerability and act for the good of yourself and others. that I think it's a beautiful path that phenomenology gives us, both from Husserl, Levinas. I didn't mention here Merleau-Ponty, but there are traces of this reasoning in Merleau-Ponty when we speak about interaffectivity. There are, for example, people who are incapable of believing in the interaffective stability of their life world, because maybe in the past they received important traumas that undermined over and over the strength of that connection. In that case, the challenge is to explore one's own body and patterns of behaviors and try to see how to shift that trauma into a renewed faith in the effective presence of oneself and the other. This is a trace that we can find, for example, in Phenomenology of Perception of Merleau-Ponty. Anyway, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed these few concepts here and there. If you have questions or comments, please just let me know. I'm always happy to read them. Have a good day. Bye.